Right? So what's the occasion? Well, the occasion appears to be that John hears about this group that doesn't have faith or needs their faith encouraged. Right? So again, we can't be 100% sure, but we can at least say, okay, here's some things that he's writing to an audience who is perhaps struggling with their faith, who needs their faith inspired. And so understanding this passage has to be understood in that context. And thinking about, this passage is meant to inspire faith and tell us something about Jesus as the Son of God. All right, so that's our introductory work. Of course, it would normally take a lot more time than that. We're shortening some of this. The genre. Genre, of course, we might say biography or gospel, but we have to be, again, careful with that, because if you're writing a biography of Winston Churchill, for example, you're going to include some things, but your overall goal is just to tell somebody interesting about Winston Churchill's life. Right? Or maybe even inspire them to be like Churchill in some respects. But the focus of the Gospels isn't just to tell you, here's some interesting things about Jesus' life. It is to inspire that belief, but it is also to help convince people, right, of the truth of who Jesus is, especially in light of his resurrection. Right? Luke, for example, is one of the clearest about this in the beginning of his Gospel. John's clear at the end of his Gospel, but Luke's clear in the beginning of his Gospel. In writing to Theophilus, he is essentially trying to convince Theophilus of the truthfulness of the things that he's been instructed in. Right? And so the Gospel is not just about, here's some interesting facts about Jesus, because if you're a Christian, you should know interesting facts about Jesus. It's about that transformative experience, that becoming like Christ, that's a part of that as well. So keeping that in mind is a part of this. Now, it would be appropriate to take the time, if you were actually engaged in doing this study for a class or a paper, to read the entirety of the book of John. Because this is not just a passage, out of the blue. I forgot to suggest one thing. One of the things that's interesting as well that you'll discover in doing your introductory work about this passage is that some manuscripts do not include John chapter 7:53 through 8:11. It is missing in some copies of the Gospel of John. And so there is a question about whether this passage was originally a part of the Gospel of John or not. It's sometimes found in other places in manuscripts of John, right? And so it moves around. Sometimes it's found in manuscripts of Luke. And so, there's that challenge as well as, is this a passage that belongs in the Gospel of John? Right? So you might have a footnote, or the text might be off in brackets in your translation, depending on what translation you're using.
If you encounter that kind of stuff, could it be kind of smart or not to, maybe prepare a lesson on something that may be controversial?
Sometimes it's better with situations like this not to address it until it comes up. Now, if you're doing a study of the book of John, for example, it's going to come up. You're going to have somebody in your audience, or you're going to have to, authentically address it yourself. I don't know that it would be good to go out and directly address it, unless you were doing it in the context of, let's say you're doing a class on things that people challenge about the Bible, right? And you like an apologetics class or something like that. It would be that it might be appropriate then, but it might not be appropriate to just say, for example, you're working with a church and the elders say, we'd like you to preach this Sunday. Right? And you decide, you know what, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to talk about the woman taking an adultery passage doesn't belong in the Gospel of John. Probably not a wise thing to do. It's not necessarily something we should avoid, but it's not necessarily something you should go out and necessarily try to bring on yourself, so to speak. Does that address your question, or other questions before we move on? So that's an important part of this challenge. But let's just say we'll preface all of that and put it aside just to focus on the exegesis. So like I said, you would want to read it, the entirety of the Gospel of John, but we're just going to take the time to read this passage, this section. Because, that would be an important thing to do as well, right? You read the entirety of the Gospel of John, figure out how this passage fits into it, and then read this passage as well, just by itself. And so starting in 753. They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been taken in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." All right, so in thinking about this, right, this is the passage we're looking at, or we're writing a paper on. We're exegeting this passage for this paper, and we've done our introductory work. We've read, we've reread, we've paid attention to genre, or we've focused on the issues about whether or not it belongs in the Gospel of John, whether it was written by John. Now we're getting to the point of talking about this passage. So what's this passage about? Trace the thought for me in this passage.
They wanted to test Jesus.
Okay, so this fits in the context of a situation where there is a testing of Jesus going on. What is the test?
If he forgives her, it violates Moses' law, but if he stones her, it just shows her not compassionate.
All right, and then also, it would also address, and this is something you would come across as well, the Roman law forbid capital punishment except by Romans, or Jews were allowed to have people killed if it had something to do with the temple. Right? So any sort of capital case or capital punishment case had to be decided by the Romans. Right? And so in the one sense, if he says, "No, don't stone her," he's going against the law of Moses. If he says stone her, then he's encouraging people to break Roman law, because this is not dealing with the temple at all. So there's no authority that any Jew has to engage in capital punishment in this context. Why is this a test? Right? That's what the test is. Why is this a test?
Because basically it's overlapping two cultural differences regarding what they forbid.
Okay, so it has to do with the overlap of the cultures. What are they hoping to accomplish by giving this test to Jesus? Right. They're looking for, right, the context of it, or the purpose of this setup is to find something that they can then charge Jesus with. If he says, "Don't stone her," what's the end game? What do they do with that?
He's breaking the law of Moses.
All right, so, all right, or what else? What else can they do to Jesus if he says, "Don't stone him"? Right. You know, so, oh yeah, he doesn't believe in the law of Moses, right? So you shouldn't listen to him, right? If he says stone her, what's the end game there? What do they do now?
He does the same stuff. All other people do that. First,
All right, possibly. They can't say that he's breaking Jewish law because the law says stone her. But what else can who else can they kind of? In one case, if he says don't stone him, they can tell other Jews, oh, you don't need to listen to him because he doesn't follow the law of Moses. If he says stone her, I mean, that's not going to help with other Jews, but what can they can take into the Romans and have them being fair with Jesus. Yeah, he's inciting people to break Roman law. Right? And so the test here, right, the entire context of this is a test. Now, how does that fit in with John's larger purpose? Remember, what's John's purpose in writing the Gospel of John? To get people to believe. How does this event, right, if we accept that it's original to the Gospel of John, right, it belongs there, and if it belongs right here, and it was written by John, and it belongs in the original text, how does that fit in with inspiring belief that Jesus is the Son of God?
I guess it kind of shows that he has wisdom higher than most people, or cleverness, or just kind of like he kind of was above the argument.
Yeah, that he is, he could, if he's totally human, he gets caught up in this argument, and the trap works. Because it seems like the only options are stone her, don't stone her. Well, what does Jesus say?
He who among you without sin cast the first stone. So it's kind of like Jesus, kind of like played on their consciousness to solve that.
Yeah, he actually tells them both. Stone her and don't stone her. Right? Because he says, right, he agrees she should be stoned. But the first person to stone her should be the one who has no sin. Right? So he's answered both. And that wasn't a possibility that they thought about. Right? And so the idea is not just to show Jesus' compassion, which he does, but it's also meant to help us see that Jesus had a wisdom, a divine wisdom, that he could understand the hearts of people. Not only the hearts of the woman that we tend to focus on, the heart of the woman that we tend to focus on, but the hearts of the people that are the scribes and Pharisees that are bringing him. And so we can just isolate this passage and talk about some things that are true about Jesus' forgiveness and his compassion to this woman. Right? That's true. But when we put it in a larger context, and we put it in the larger context of some of the introductory work, we begin to see some things that maybe we didn't see if we had just focused on how we traditionally focus on this passage. The other thing, of course, is that with this passage, it's really easy to get wrapped up in some of these small and insignificant things. People have really gotten wrapped up with what's Jesus writing on the ground. Right? Because it says twice. And this is the only case in all of the Gospels we actually see Jesus writing anything. And people want to know, what's he writing? And evidently this is not a new thing, it's not a contemporary thing. There are some manuscripts, you might have a translation that has this in a footnote, that he wrote on the ground the sins of each of them. And so there's some manuscripts that say he was like writing adultery, greed, covetousness, or whatever on the ground. But don't get wrapped up in that point. Right? Don't fall into that trap like something is, and go out and make a sermon about, right, Jesus writing on the ground. Right? When we don't know what he wrote, and that's odd. I mean, this is not something that God or John has seen fit to record for us. And so again, while you can understand some things about this passage just by reading it, by engaging in exegesis, we get a deeper understanding of the text. Right? We were able to more faithfully relate this text because it's in the context of Jesus as the Son of God and proving that to people. Questions or comments? All right. Our next step is to move into theology, but since we just have a few brief minutes left, we're going to go ahead and stop a little early instead of getting into that next topic, which is going to be quite extensive. So we'll wait and pick that up on